So the point is that from Thomas Malthus, Spencer is going to develop a biological model when he mixes Malthus with Charles Darwin. Ward, who's going to have the same influences, is going to develop a sociological model. And the argument becomes that humans are not driven by natural selection the same way a cat, a dog, an elephant, or all other life forms are. Because humans are conscious, because humans are, in effect, the pinnacle of evolution, humans become responsible for natural selection. So his point is that either humans engage in natural selection within society or nature will do it. This would not end well. This is plague, war, pestilence, but one way or the other, humans can't escape natural selection. So natural selection becomes a function of society. And if you think about the implications of that, how a society is designed. So, for example, if you apply Ward to contemporary American society, our refusal to provide universal health care would be an indication that we've made a decision that some people don't deserve it because natural selection dictates they don't deserve it. The top 1% gets all the money because they're the ones who are best fit for survival. No, that's a great question, KJ. Ward does not differentiate between who will survive if we do it or if nature will do it. But the assumption, as you can imagine, is that in some shape or form, best suited to survive. Make sense? Okay. Any other questions so far?
I guess.
Sure. Any one of you, whichever one of you wants to go.
I was just going to say, so at this point, the way that this natural selection is kind of evolved, is it even natural selection anymore? Because at this point, we're just kind of manipulating it to how it works best for us, I guess.
Well, because we as a society are going to have to make that decision. Remember, the background for this is the Darwinian triple helix. Remember that?
Right.
So what do you think the implications of Ward's argument are in terms of the Darwinian triple helix?
So that would fall under the social, right?
Yeah. And what happens if we don't take responsibility for natural selection within our society?
War, pestilence, disease.
Right.
Yes, but also something else will happen. The Darwinian model, I'll get to you in chat room in just a second, is driven by conflict.
Right.
Yes, that's right. Well done, KJ. So if we don't engage in natural selection within our society, we're going to lose. See the point?
Yes. Yeah, I do. That clears that up. Thank you.
Yeah. So remember, when we trace these out, this is how it plays out. And remember, what did Ross say? Yeah, go ahead.
It was based on race suicide.
Yep.
Suicide. It was if something along the lines of like if white people couldn't have more children, then the other races, the inferior races, would dominate white people in a sense.
Exactly. And there would not be a shot fired, and the weak would dominate the strong.
Right.
Because remember, what's the assumption of these people? Their assumption is that Northern European whites are the pinnacle of evolution. Got it?
Yes.
So it would be bad enough for them to lose to an inferior race. It would also be contrary to all the laws of nature. Make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Okay. So it shouldn't be a surprise remember, we also said that Galton, Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, is in favor of eugenics. Okay, but if they lost, wouldn't that mean they would no longer be the superior race? That's a great question. And that's why they're arguing it's contrary to the laws of nature. It would be obscene. Make sense? Yes? Good.
I have a question. So they're saying it would be obscene it would be against nature for them not to perpetrate the white race, essentially, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last class you mentioned that there's sort of a religious, like there was a religious element as well. How does that, or is that veering too far off?
No, because part of what's going to happen in this mess is that the way that Ward approaches it, on the one hand, will lead to Keller endorsing eugenics. And this is where Planned Parenthood in the United States is born. At the same time that this is happening, a guy by the name of Fisk takes the Darwinian methodology and interprets it in such a way that it becomes the foundation for Christianity. So you end up at this point. I understand. So you end up at this point with almost two different kinds of Christian social Darwinism. Fisk is going to be picked up by Washington Gladden and by Josiah Strong. Both Gladden and Strong believe that the ultimate destiny of the world and the solution to all the problems of the world is to make the world, one, Christian, and B, to be based on European culture. If we do that, all the social problems in the world will go away. There is a second stream which doesn't involve Fisk, but which comes out of the post-Civil War Great Awakening. You may recall that we said there have been 4 of them. They are conservative retreats. They are a swing to the right, to fundamentalism. William Jennings Bryan will champion the birth of what we now know as fundamentalist Christianity. The Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it. Interestingly, there are strong elements of social Darwinism in the fundamentalism. I may have told you that on the night that William Jennings Bryan died, across the United States, the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses in his memory. And as Lincoln had before him, he clearly asserted that people of color and Northern European whites cannot live side by side. So the upshoot of this is how the ideological divide that we see every day in our country happened. All right, are there any questions about this? Okay, given, one sec, we have 2 chat messages. Okay, good. All right, given that we've taken a bit of a side, we're probably going to go over a little bit so that I can get through the material we need to cover tonight. All right. Let's now go back to Auguste Comte. By way of a brief review, remember he said there are 3 stages to human society and human religion. This is a process of moving toward an increasingly rational and logical view of the world. Logic and reason make positivism of man. If you think about the implications of this, God is superfluous, not necessary. And God is not relevant. Positivism, interestingly enough, resembles Christianity without God. And we're going to see momentarily how that plays out. All right, are there any questions about this?
No questions.
Okay. We're going to start by taking a look at England in the 19th century. The same thing that happened in the United States happened in England, which is that as the Industrial Revolution begins and increases, there is significant urban migration. And now there's a new class of poor people, the urban inner city poor. And the infrastructure of many of the cities in England is pushed beyond capacity. Workers become parts to the great industrial machine. So we end up with a two-class society. Okay, don't infer from this that there was absolutely no middle class, but compared to the rich and the poor, they are a minority. And they typically don't fare any better than the poor. The Church of England was a source of oppression. We shouldn't be surprised because the only people who could become clergy were, in fact, the wealthy people who could afford to go to Oxford and Cambridge. It openly opposed any form of social reform. The church had the power to tax. It taxed in the form of requiring a tithe. If you failed to pay the tithe on time, there was an interest charge. If you failed to pay the interest charge and the tithe, the church took everything you owned. If you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge or one of the better schools in England, if you wanted a professional life, you had to sign the 39 Articles of Faith, which essentially meant that you endorsed everything that the Church of England said and stood for. England's perpetual wars with France ended, and all the soldiers who came back from the front had no jobs. Those people who did worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. So, in some respects, you have high unemployment. You have a grossly overworked population that lives in poverty. And the result was incessant social turmoil to the point where the Prime Minister of England called out the military to put down riots, similar to what happened here in the 1880s. Same thing. So from a straight Darwinian perspective, if you're poor, you have nowhere to go. You will die in poverty. There is no hope. Because of the church's control of education, if you were poor, you did not get to go to school. The Unitarian Church, which essentially believes that there is only one God, but multiple ways to get to that God, started what we now know today as Sunday school. It allowed the poor to learn to read. A very small subset of the poor would actually learn to write. A very small subset. Okay, before I go on, are there any questions?
I do have one question, because it seems like when we talk about the rise of Sunday school, there's a slight shift in what is available to the different classes. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but since church had to, well, they didn't have to, but they chose to use tithing as a form of tax, that seemed like it would push members of the church more into the rich class. What causes Sunday school, or the evolution of it, to become slightly more inclusive to the lower class?
Okay. In England, their equivalent of Congress is divided in two. The clergy, because they were generally from the upper class, served in the House of Lords. They taxed the poor, not to help the poor, but because they wanted a particular lifestyle. They gave nothing back. But the Unitarian Church, by contrast, their clergy, although they're not technically clergy in the same sense as a priest in the Church of England, were typically themselves from the poor end of town. They also tended to be social reformers. And for whatever reason, they decided that teaching the poor to read was the socially responsible thing to do. Now, an important point to keep in mind. Christianity has a very clear theology. The Church of England has a very clear theology. The Unitarian Church does not. So what will happen because of the influence of the Unitarian Church will be quite fascinating. Great question. Did I answer your question effectively?
You did. I believe, my way of understanding it anyway, is there starts to be a divide between the Church of England and the Unitarian Church, the Church of England being more traditional and led by clergy who are, in this case, rich, and the Unitarian, who is essentially led by people who maybe not completely poor, but on closer to that end.
Yes, and they have a social conscience as well.
Okay, so the divide in those two churches is what leads to a little bit of social reform toward the poor.
Yes.
Okay.
Brilliantly said. Well done.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Any other questions before I clear the screen and we take a 5 or 10 second break so I can edit this video?
Yes.
All right.
Oh, like you said earlier, the Church of England supported the rich rather than the poor. Why does religion, especially in these times, have so much influence or tie-in with social and political status?
Yeah. The Church of England became almost indistinguishable from the power structure of the British government. In effect, England was a kind of theocracy. The only difference was that the Archbishop of Canterbury, technically the head of the Church of England, did not control who became prime minister. But aside from that, the power structure of England and the power structure of the Church of England were inseparable.
A quick follow-up question, and did this apply across? Because I'm assuming this was like time where they had the huge empire. Did this apply across the empire, or was this just in England proper?
No, pretty much across the empire, and we find similar behavior in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Specifically,
I'm sorry, say that again, Michael?
like specifically, like in what way, and like what form in the United States?
Well, for example, if you think about how the Christian right looks at the United States, as far as they're concerned, we're a Christian country.
Yeah.
So if you take it a step further, abortion, which in conservative Christianity is considered murder, can't be tolerated. They will do everything they can to end Roe versus Wade, because in their mind, we are a Christian country. Make sense?
Yes.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Not so much a question, more, a comment is It intrigues me to see the shift of theology in that department. Because if we go back to what we were talking about earlier today, with eugenics primarily being supported by, upper class whites in Europe. And if you think about in America, the Christian right, how it seems like the former is more in favor of eugenics, which we talked about. Planned Parenthood could potentially be a form of that, and how in modern times the Christian right in America is opposed to that. So I mean, I'm drawing parallels for how the theology of that has changed over the years.
Yes, and you're doing a good job of that, but I'll offer a caveat.
Sure.
Prior to the election in the fall, I don't know how it happened. It may be the fact that I'm marooned in this godforsaken wilderness called North Carolina. But most of my friends are extremely conservative. And one of them and I were having coffee, and in one of, I'm multiracial, but unless you know that, you're going to confuse me for Southern European. And this one particular conservative person, despite the fact that I've told him repeatedly that I am not white, continues to think of me within that vein. So we were in the middle of an intense conversation, and he said,